My father was a truck driver, and this experience shook him to his core. Christmas of 2007 was an event that has always stood out in my mind, and now it always will. I was 13 at the time, and that was the first and only year that Dad missed Christmas. He worked as a long-haul truck driver, and we were used to him being gone for weeks or even occasional months at a time. He always made it a point to be home for our birthdays and Christmas, however, but that year was different. Mom was worried when he said he had one final load to deliver before the holiday season. He planned to make his delivery and then be home on the 23rd just in time for Christmas, but Mother Nature had other ideas. As fate would have it, his route from our home in Minneapolis to Billings, Montana would take him right into the heart of a looming blizzard along I-94. Snow was falling in bunches at the time, and Dad said he was debating whether or not to pull over for the night in hopes it would clear up. He decided to try and just keep going when the road decided for him. He was only about an hour away from Billings when his truck struck an unexpected patch of ice, causing him to lose control and slide off the road into the median. Thankfully, he wasn't injured, but his truck was wedged in nearly 2 feet of packed snow. It was around midnight when this happened. He tried everything he could to get the truck out of the snowdrift, but it was no use. Of course, his phone signal was non-existent as well, so he couldn't even call for assistance. The roads were virtually devoid of other travelers by that point as well. He radioed into a local emergency office, but was told the roads were too hazardous to travel at the moment. In the end, he could do nothing but wait. Meanwhile, Christmas came and went for us, and we didn't hear anything from Dad. Mom was a nervous wreck, although she tried to hide it, while me and my 2 sisters were just sad that he wasn't there with us. Thankfully, Dad finally called late on Christmas evening. He apologized profusely for not being with us and promised he would get home as soon as possible. He did just that 2 days later, and we were relieved to have him back. He returned with a bundle of late Christmas gifts, and all was well once more. Dad was different though. He was quiet and appeared as though his mind was focused elsewhere. I didn't question him on it, but I could tell that something was troubling him. Life went on, and Dad never missed another Christmas after that. He began just taking the entire month of December off to prevent anything like that from ever happening again. I didn't know this at the time, but he later told me that he never drove down I-94 again. He outright refused deliveries that took him along that stretch and would take detours that added multiple hours to his trip if it meant avoiding that spot. We kids are all grown up now, with kids of our own. My son just turned 2, and our whole family was once again together over this previous Christmas. We sat around watching as Mom and Dad lovingly spoiled their grandchildren with goodies. I don't think I've ever seen my dad with such a beaming smile. Later that night, when the sugar rush had finally worn off and the kids had gone to bed, Dad and I were left alone on the balcony. We sipped some of his whiskey and puffed on cigars as we got to talking. I'll skip over the bulk of what we talked about because that's not really why I'm here. Eventually, we started talking about his newfound retirement from truck driving, and I asked him a question that I'd never really asked before. You ever experience anything creepy on the road? Dad was no stranger to talking about his experiences. He had infamous tales of him getting mobbed by crackheads in Atlanta, hitting a cow in Nebraska, and the things he saw while driving through Ferguson a few years back during the civil unrest. He was never shy to tell them, but this time, he paused. He swished the whiskey around his glass for a moment, as if silently debating whether he wanted to tell me. I guess I might as well tell you now. He downed the remainder of his drink and clasped his hands in front of him. You remember the year I missed Christmas? By this point, I had almost entirely forgotten about it, but when he said that, a torrent of memories came spiraling back. "Yeah, Mom was pissed," I replied. Dad gave a hearty chuckle at that and nodded. "Oh yeah, she never let me forget it. That was that crazy blizzard, right? When your truck got stuck." Dad nodded. "Yup, damn near flipped my rig that night. Ironically, that snowdrift probably saved my life just as much as it screwed me over." He then paused and broke eye contact as he contemplated his wording. That wasn't the scary part though. Dad explained that the area he went off the road was essentially a barren wasteland. No cities or gas stations around him, just a winding expanse of road in both directions between dozens of foothills. He again mentioned he had no cell reception and wasn't sure what to do aside from just waiting for someone to pass by. After a few minutes, it became apparent that wasn't going to happen. The snow fell in buckets that night, and before long it nearly reached the bottom of his door. Dad's truck at the time was a Cascadia 125 mid-roof sleeper. He had a full sleeping compartment behind the front seat and provisions to last him a few weeks if necessary. He wasn't too worried about being stranded, at least not at first. After giving up on getting his phone to work, he crawled into the bunk area of the cab and popped a DVD into his portable TV. He figured he may be stuck out there for at least the night, so he might as well just relax until help arrives. He made sure to insist that if he wanted to, he could have probably figured out a way to get his truck out if he tried, but he was exhausted and decided to just get some sleep. He said he drifted off not long after, only to awake sometime later to complete darkness. The temperature had plummeted and he instinctually hugged his arms and felt the goosebumps lining his arms. He'd left his truck idling before he fell asleep, but it wasn't running anymore. Confused, he crawled into the front seat to find the keys still in the ignition. He twisted the key and the engine soon rumbled back to life, but something was wrong. He said the noise of the engine morphed into a gurgling, clanging mess of metal and fluid that produced a god-awful cacophony. His dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree, displaying just about every single warning light the system had. Steam began to pour from the hood vents, and the distinct smell of boiling coolant filled the air. After letting it run for maybe 10 seconds, he shut it off in fear of doing permanent damage to it. He knew that something wasn't right with it, and sighed as he contemplated going out into the cold night to see if he could figure out what it was. He bundled himself up tight and popped the hood. He said the night had this almost ethereal silence to it as he stepped out of the cab. His feet crunched in the snow, echoing like crashing thunder when compared to the pervasive silence. He made his way around the front and opened it up, releasing a plume of steam from within. After it dissipated a bit, he leaned in and found something which made him quite confused. Oil and coolant were splashed all over the underside of the hood, with many other parts of the engine covered in gunk as well. Dad climbed off the grill and glanced underneath the carriage, and that's when he found something truly odd. The oil pan was shredded on the bottom of the engine. He said it looked as though someone had chopped it with an axe a couple dozen times. The oil had all spilled out into the snow beneath. That was why the engine had been running so rough, but explaining how it happened was another matter entirely. He checked around the area and said it seemed like some of the oil was dripped away from the road and towards the trees. He looked closer and spied what very much seemed like footprints accompanying them. As if the winter night wasn't cold enough, that discovery tanked his blood temperature. He quickly headed back towards his cab, but as he reached for the handle, something stopped him dead in his tracks. Something moved behind the end of his trailer, too quick to make out any physical details. It moved on two legs and was no animal. Dad just froze, his fight or flight instincts seeming to stalemate within him. He thought about calling out, but said that didn't seem like a good idea. After a few seconds of silence, he made a mad dash to his cab and locked the doors behind him. After grabbing the pistol from underneath his seat, he hopped into the rear with his heart racing. He positioned himself where he was able to glance out both side mirrors, but saw no sign of whoever was behind the trailer. The radio too was out, and after trying in vain to get it to work, he sat back. It didn't make any sense to him. Even if the engine wouldn't fire up, the batteries should have had enough reserve charge to power the radio for a little while. He tried calling on his cell phone too, and although managed to get it to ring a few times, it would always just cut out. Hours passed and not much of anything happened. He dozed off once or twice, but tried his best to stay awake and wait for the sun to rise. The snow had since stopped, but not a single other car had driven by since he had stopped. He figured the pass itself was closed, but hoped someone would have been by. Sometime later, he heard a noise emanate from outside. It started as a slight thump, with another soon following, then another and another. The sounds gradually grew louder, and his heart lodged in his throat as it grew nearer. Someone was on his trailer, and he didn't know what to do about it. He clutched his pistol tight, aiming it up towards the roof. Just as he was certain the person was about to reach the roof of the cab, the sound stopped. He waited there, pistol trembling in his grip for them to emerge, but they never did. Minutes turned to hours, and he never heard another sound from the roof. He said after a while he was no longer even sure whether he had heard anything, to begin with. Eventually, his guard slipped, and the drowsiness took over. He doesn't know if this next part is related, but he's never had anything happen like it, so I figured I'd include it too. He dreamed as he slept there, but it wasn't a normal dream. He said he remembers walking through a dark forest and viewing it all with incredible vivid detail. He was completely lucid, and says to this day, almost 30 years later, it was the most incredibly realistic dream he's ever had. Even looking back on it, he says it felt so real it's hard for him to distinguish it from reality. He seemed genuinely disturbed as he told me about it too. The forest he was walking through had these massive looming trees that seemed hundreds of feet tall. Twisted roots surrounded their bases, which sprouted from the ground and twisted all over like the tentacles of the kraken. He had to dip and duck around them as he moved, going further but not knowing why. As he made his way through, he started hearing this noise like the ticking of a clock. It got louder as he moved, and then sure enough he found the source. A large grandfather clock ticking away in the middle of the bundle of roots. He stopped and stared at it for a moment as it ticked away. The clock's tone reverberated but began to slow. In a few moments, it had begun ticking much slower, and the clock itself began to melt. Suddenly, he saw things emerging in the distance from behind the trees, horrible twisted creatures like the spawns of hell. The sounds of cackling and snarling swirled around him, and he began to run. He hurtled and leaped through the roots, but didn't make it far. Something struck him hard from behind, knocking him onto his chest. He then awoke with a gasp, panting heavily with a cold sweat permeating his entire body. He scrambled to a seated position while on the brink of panic. His heart was throbbing so fast and hard that it ached. He took a moment to compose himself, and the immense relief that overcame him was one of sheer relief, but it did not last. Something moved at his window, and his eyes shot up. There he saw the face staring back at him. He froze, as stiff as a corpse and cold as a glacier. Time seemed to stand still then, but finally, he found the strength to raise his pistol. He fired without really even thinking. A loud bang reverberated in, and the muzzle flare momentarily disoriented him. He looked up to see a bullet hole in the window, and no sign of the face. After waiting there a few moments, he ventured to the driver's seat and peered out, but there was nothing there. No sign of that thing ever being there. It didn't make sense to him, as he was certain he saw it. What made even less sense was the fact that his phone read that it was only 12:13 a.m. Last he remembered checking his phone, it read 12:08 a.m., and he swears on everything that had to have been at least an hour before he dozed off. By this point in his story, I had to question myself on whether he was pulling my leg. My father is a bit of a prankster for sure, but he's never weaved an elaborate story like this before. He then spent some time glancing around out the windows and ensuring no one else was around. He almost thought he should just leave his truck and start walking back to town, but obviously that was an incredibly dangerous notion that probably would have gotten him killed. He stared at his phone for quite a while, watching the minutes slowly tick onward, too slowly. He swore time wasn't working as normal. Several times he counted aloud to 60, doing his best to approximate a minute, but the minute didn't change accordingly. He eventually just kept counting upwards, finding the minute finally changed when he reached 386. You'd think that after all these worrying discoveries, sleep would have been the last thing he wanted, but it wasn't enough to prevent it. He said he tried adamantly to resist the urge, but the drowsiness that overtook him was impossible to fight. He found himself walking in the snow, listening as it crunched beneath his feet. A dark and silent forest surrounded him in all directions. It was robotic, as if his body acted of its own accord while his mind drifted in the doldrums. He could barely see where he was going, but it didn't seem to matter. Suddenly he stopped and seemed to spring back to reality. He glanced around from side to side, a sudden terror gripping him. Where was he? Why was he outside of his truck? He wondered. He spun back, but couldn't even see the road behind him. The cold sunk into him, and then he saw it. From further in the woods, a familiar face stared back, pale, gaunt, and inhuman. It crawled on all fours, shimmering and shifting side to side. My father turned the complete other way and ran like hell. Tree branches raked against him as he fled half-blind away from the thing in the woods. Nothing looked familiar, and he just continued running aimlessly through the woods, checking behind him periodically to see if the thing was following him. He never saw it or heard it, but he knew it was there. Eventually, he smelled the faint scent of smoke lingering in the air. He followed it, hearing a commotion behind him, and soon came across a small clearing. In the center of it was a log cabin with smoke trickling from the chimney. Seeing no other option, he dashed towards it and knocked on the door. Behind him, he could hear odd sounds coming from the woods, and thankfully the door opened a few seconds later. "Who are you? What do you want?" The voice of an elderly man called from within. Dad turned and saw the barrel of a shotgun aimed at his chest. He slowly raised his hands to convey he meant no threat. "Please, sir, he said. He paused as he thought that certainly this man was going to think he was some lunatic, but he said it anyway. "There's something out there." The man's furious glance reverted to one of intrigue. He then looked past my dad and out into the forest, his eyes suddenly growing wide. Suddenly he backed up, still aiming the shotgun at my dad while waving him inside. He pointed him over to a chair in the corner. Dad complied and sat as the man locked up behind him. He waited there a couple of seconds, but heard nothing of concern. "What are you doing out here?" My dad then told him what had happened with his truck and the blizzard. He then told him about the odd occurrences that had happened later on, which culminated in him suddenly sleepwalking through the woods. The man sighed and finally lowered his shotgun. He got my dad some water and took a seat across from him. "Lot of weird things in these woods." Dad paused as he waited for the man to continue. The man formally introduced himself as Duncan and said his family had owned that plot of land for nearly 100 years. He said he lost count of how many search parties had come through over the years, as well as thrill seekers, ghost hunters, and generally odd people. I saw a face. Dad finally confessed to him. Duncan eyed him curiously. What kind of face? Dad described it much as he had before, and Duncan just shook his head. Well, that's a new one. He let out a sarcastic chuckle then. You hear all kinds of stories. UFOs, Bigfoot, cults, but none of them can ever provide proof. So you don't believe in any of it? My dad asked, only to be countered by Duncan. Of course I do. I've lived out here long enough to know that we humans do not dictate these woods. Some things lurk in shadows all over the globe, and we may never understand them. But as for what you saw, he paused for a moment, seeming to contemplate as he folded his hands on his lap. There's a group of Native Americans that are rumored to have once lived here, the Apolkari. Ever hear of them? Dad shook his head. Neither had I, but a friend of mine who has since passed told me about him. He was an Arapaho man himself, and said that for generations his people had told tales of these Apolkari. Most other groups feared them and said the things they did were evil, more so than the standard tribal warfare one would expect. People say they held these rituals and experiments and were rumored that their cruelty was matched only by their intellects. Some people say they weren't even human, but that's neither here nor there. Duncan trailed off once more, taking a sip of tea from his side table. One of the rumors that many people attribute to the Apolkari is that of the wrong ones. A lot of names for them really, not rights, liars, and uncannies. Things that look human but ain't, and some look less human than others. Long faces, wide mouths, huge eyes, a lot of variations. Some say they can affect time and space itself, and others blame them for a lot of weird disappearances. He paused and took another sip, then chuckled. I can't speak to the validity of all that firsthand, but things for certain. There are a lot of weird disappearances, and no one seems to have an answer for them. The air from the room seemed to deflate from his torso, and Dad eyed the curious man. He'd seen a lot over his time, but Dad didn't know how much of his tales to believe. He still doesn't. If all these things are happening, then why do you live out here? Dad finally asked. Duncan reclined in the seat and thought. Dad expected an answer related to his inherited property, but the reality was a bit different. He did mention his ancestral home being part of it, but had more to say. If I was 20 years younger, maybe I would leave, but I don't think it'd matter. There ain't a place on earth you could run to if they wanted to get you. Dad said a shiver descended his spine then, and Duncan didn't seem boastful or wild as he spoke, but more as though his realization was just a foregone conclusion. Thankfully, Duncan allowed my dad to stay the night, and in the morning the two of them made their way back to the road. Luckily, Duncan had a big Dodge diesel that was able to plow through the snow with relative ease. They soon reached my dad's abandoned rig, finding it in an even worse state than he'd last seen it the previous night. Multiple tires were slashed, windows were broken, and the engine was shredded from the bottom. After looking around, though, he found nothing had been stolen. Duncan gave him a ride into town to get his truck towed, and a week or so later he was finally headed home. So, do you believe in that kind of stuff? I finally asked him after he seemed to be done retelling his story. Well, I'd be kinda stupid not to now. He and I both laughed at that, but clearly, he had more he wanted to say. It was a really weird experience for sure, but I've always thought that maybe I misremembered it or subconsciously exaggerated it in my mind. Something about it, though, is just so haunting. Like I saw something that night that I wasn't supposed to see, and never want to see again. He just sat there for a moment in silence, and I figured it best not to ask him any more questions. He eventually told me that between the time he crashed his truck to when he finally made it into town with Duncan, 3 entire days had passed. He still doesn't know how to account for that, and apparently Duncan didn't either. There's a lot of unanswered questions to this that he may never get the answer to now. He kept in touch with Duncan over the years, but unfortunately, he passed away back in 2019. I love my dad, and it's disconcerting seeing him that way, confused and terrified. I cannot completely attest to the validity of his story, but I believe him. For many who read this, I'm sure it will just amount to words on a paper, or maybe a fictitious story that entertained you for a few minutes, but to me, it's a horrific possibility at the very least. If anyone has any experiences like this or theories, then feel free to share them. Whatever the case, you won't catch me anywhere near I-94 in Billings anytime soon. There's a reason most truckers don't stop for hitchhikers. You know how in college or when you're just dirt poor, you come to enjoy certain shit foods? Like ramen, microwave burritos, and cheap frozen pizza. I figure it's the same principle with long-haul drivers and truck stops. I'd only been on the road for 2 years before, and I'd only be on it for another 3 after, but I'd already grown a taste for greasy sausages and bad coffee. This time I couldn't enjoy the crappy meal on account of the man sitting 2 booths over. His appearance and clothes were normal enough, if a bit underdressed for the Colorado winter. I think it was the way he stared, scanning the room like the damn Terminator, that creeped me out. And all he had in front of him was an untouched cup of decaf. I usually savored these little breaks, but I hurried to finish this time. Partly to beat the weather, and partly to get out from under those eyes. Before the waitress came with my check, the man took a seat in the booth across from me without asking. "You a trucker?" He had one of those accents that's impossible to place. "Yeah." "Would you allow me to ride with you?" he said with an off-putting smile. "What? To anywhere?" "You some drifter?" "I have been for some time, but I'm heading home, now." "I haven't been home in so long." "Shit, you don't even know where I'm going." He blinked at that, the first time I'd seen the gesture from him, then his smile widened. "Oh. Going over Vale Pass?" Yeah. To Junction. And then? Salt Lake. I knew this wasn't the 60s and big rigs weren't held up by the mob anymore. Even still, I figured if he asked where I was headed next, I'd lie. "You are going where I need to go. I'd very much appreciate a lift. I'd like to help." That was a lie. But I'm not supposed to pick up hitchhikers. Company vehicle, C. I'm not sure how long the waitress had been there, but enough, I suppose, 'cause she leaned in and whispered, "Please take him out of here. I'll comp your meal, but he's been here all day eyeing me funny. Please." I never have learned how to say no to women, so I sighed and told the stranger to follow me. "What's your name?" I asked as he took a seat. He shifted his weight and said, "We don't need to know each other's names." Then added, "Call me whatever you'd like." "Fine by me," I said, not curious a whit about his name or story. I had a piece of jerky on the dash. "How about Jim?" "If you'd like." "Sorry," I said after a few chilly minutes of uncomfortable silence. "The heater doesn't work all that great." "It'll be nice to get home," he said. It's so much warmer than here. About that time, the snow started coming down thick and I cut my speed in half. Another rig, thick chains on the tires, was tearing down the mountain, clearly none too happy to be stuck behind me. I took the next pull off and the driver flashed his hazards and thanks. "What are we doing?" asked Jim after the familiar hiss of the air brakes quieted. "Checking the weather report. Strapping up the wheels, maybe." Said Jim, his smile gone and brow creased. Then he nodded. "All right. I suppose that'll be fine." I hadn't asked his opinion, but whatever. My phone was lucky to get any service, but I got my answers. Snow was expected to come in waves for several more hours. On this mountain, weather like that had been the end of more than one long hauler. I wasn't desperate enough for cash to risk it. "I hate to do this to you, Jim," I said, sincerely. 4 or 5 hours parked with my new friend did not sound fun. But we're stuck here. We don't look stuck. I just mean it wouldn't be safe to keep driving. I'll help you put the chains on," Jim said, his smile back. "Nah, sorry, I don't push it going downhill on a snowy mountain. But I need to get home. It's just a few hours." He shook his head, empty smile once again vanished. "You don't understand. If we don't go now, I won't make it home until who knows when. It's a place, man. It isn't going anywhere." Jim paused. "Yes, it isn't going anywhere. At least we agreed." His eyes followed a van with a driver braver than myself. "You wishing you'd hitched a ride with him?" I asked. And he squinted, then, almost like he was trying to read the license plate. "No, they aren't going where I'm going." "That's too bad, then, but I'll still be headed toward your home after the weather clears." "No, you won't." I shivered, and I don't think it was the cold. "Don't you have a job to do?" said Jim. I started to get angry, then, or maybe I was afraid, but I was shaking either way. "Look, I can handle my own business, Jim. Nothing in this trailer is perishable. If I'm a little late, I'm a little late." "No," he shouted, and I swear for a moment his face barely looked human. "I insist you drive, now." He was like a small child, throwing a tantrum. "All right, that's enough," I said, hand ready to dart for the glove box where I kept my Magnum. But I swear Jim's eyes bore right through the plastic, and he knew that I was packing. "Okay," my voice cracked. "I don't like doing this, but you're freaking me out. I need you to leave. Now." My eyes do not leave my passengers, my right hand still ready to grab the gun. I used my left to fish around for a bag, a bottle of water, my spare coat, and a few sticks of jerky. I tossed it all on Jim's lap. "The diner's only a couple miles back. Just stay off the shoulder and you should be fine." He just stared, motionless. I almost wished he would explode again. "This is my truck. I'm telling you to leave." "I won't need these," he said, dropping the coat and bag but taking the jerky from my dash. He didn't seem angry anymore. Sad, maybe. And then he hopped out. "Wait, it's 10 degrees, I yelled. Grabbing the gun and coat, I darted outside, wincing at the wind. There was no sign of Jim, and his track stopped after 10 feet or so. I considered calling out, but I guess I was too relieved. Maybe that makes me a shit person, I don't know. But I got back in the cab, locked both doors, kept my revolver handy, and didn't sleep a wink until Grand Junction 10 hours later. Now, I'm sure he was just some lunatic I picked up at a diner. I know that. But sometimes, on snowy March nights, I can't help but wonder, Sometimes I wonder. I'm quitting my new job as a truck driver. I am fairly new to the whole truck driving experience. I took up this lifestyle a meager 6 months ago after I suffered an excruciating 10-year gig at a health insurance call center. With this new driving job, I typically transport auto mechanic parts statewide. The job pays fairly well for my humble lifestyle as a bachelor and grants me an adventure with every route. The past 6 months have been so liberating compared to the 9-to-5 hellhole that gradually chipped away at my sanity. I couldn't take another second of sitting in that suffocating cubicle without going psychotic or strangling myself with my headset cord. The open road was the savior of my soul. I spent every day traveling somewhere new in my truck and blasting my music. Long gone were the constant hums of countless telephones ringing and the mundane chatter of soulless office consultants. I have been able to explore the nooks of my state, and I've met interesting characters during these travels. Despite the liberation that truck driving delivers, after this latest journey, I am ready to hang my hat and leave this industry altogether. You see, this last route took me along a desolate old dirt road out in the boonies outskirts of Amarillo, Texas. The delivery started as any other. I was to transport custom automobile parts to a receiving facility in the heart of Amarillo. With my departure beginning in Fort Worth, I had quite an extensive drive ahead through the monotonous plains of Texas. The drive was unremarkable and lengthy. I drove through numerous boony towns that consisted of rusted buildings and dilapidated streets. The interstate highways offered no saving grace from the dull drive. Vast brown plains extended on either side of my truck while mesquite trees folded over themselves starved for a drop of water. Dried tumbleweed skittered alongside the dry breeze as if to escape the scorched earth. This pattern of monotony persisted until I reached about 70 miles outside of my destination. Twinkling stars danced along the night sky's horizon as the brights of my headlights illuminated the vacant two-way road ahead. It had been over an hour since a vehicle had sped past my truck at the mile marker labeled 140. Not a living soul besides myself inhabited the road. I was alone. At my sides, looming shadows of tangled foliage erupted from the pitch-black plains. Their dead branches curled up like wretched claws reaching for the glimmering stars in the inky sky. The empty road ahead, coupled with the silence in my cab, caused a creeping eeriness down into the roots of my soul. I knew just the cure for this dilemma. I began to quickly fumble with the radio dial, seeking to cure the unease of the piercing silence and to liven the damper atmosphere. I was met with droning static with each radio station I dialed through. I furrowed my brow as I knew the lack of a radio signal should have been impossible with my proximity to the city. I sped past the mile 66 marker while quizzically pondering the cause of the radio's inability to receive a signal. I alternated from peering at the radio and back to the desolate road when a flicker of light caught my eye in the side mirrors of my truck. The pinprick of a single headlight shone through the immense darkness behind me. Finally, I thought, a motorcyclist embarking on a late-night cruise would relieve my perturbed spirit. I sighed a breath of relief as the loneliness began to dissipate from my racing mind. I turned off the radio and refocused my attention on the long stretch of road ahead. I peeked back at my side mirrors to check on my lone companion. My breath caught in my dry throat. What was once a pinprick of light evolved into a bright orb of luminosity in a matter of seconds. How did this traveler manage to close so much distance in a matter of moments? Their figure was still obscured by the cloak of darkness, but their headlight was rapidly intensifying as they sped forward. I slowed my speed to allow the traveler to bypass my truck. I glanced back to my left side mirror to discover the motorcyclist was now maintaining a healthy distance behind my truck. My heart stopped as, upon closer inspection, all of my previous presumptions of this person were immediately rendered false. This was no motorcyclist at all, it was a bicyclist. How in the hell did this pedaled means of locomotion move so damn fast? Perplexed, my eyes squinted to further study this phenomenon. Almost immediately, my situation went from quite odd to absolutely terrifying. The figure was entirely naked. Smooth white skin covered its tall, thin frame. Impossibly long, crooked arms extended from the handlebars of the bicycle. Pointed elbows jutted outwards towards the dark sky as enormous claws gripped at the bike's handles. The person's legs were too long for its body. Its sharp knees projected outwards, meeting its wretched elbows. The figure was proportionately comical. I mean, its body was just too damn tall compared to the bicycle's petite frame. Its face was the most horrifying of all. It was entirely smooth and devoid of both eyes and a nose. White skin stretched over its hollow eye sockets down to a sharp spear-like chin. However, an incredibly wide mouth extended to where its ears should have been. Rows of jagged teeth, similar to sharks, decorated an impossibly broad smile. It pedaled with a merry tempo, slowly zigzagging while its long limbs slid past each other in a disgusting dance. I floored the gas pedal. My heart pounded as the truck's engine roared with all of the horsepower it could muster. I could see the bike's headlight fade into a minuscule ball of light as the distance between us speedily increased. I exhaled the trapped air from my lungs as the figure disappeared from view. An anxious sweat slithered down the goosebumps on my neck as my heart strained to regain a regular rhythm. What the hell was that thing? My mind anxiously pondered. My truck regained a much more legal speed as the adrenaline began its decline from my body. My eyes captured another mile marker along the side of the barren road. Mile 66. Hell no. 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 No! This mile marker should be long gone. I know that I passed it long before that creature made its appearance. I had no choice but to press forward. What other option did I have? My tight grip on the steering wheel caused my knuckles to turn bone white. I made another glance at my mirrors. My gaze was met with an empty road behind me. I tried to regulate my breathing as my eyes shifted to the shadowy plains on my left. What I witnessed almost caused me to swerve off the road. That forsaken creature was pedaling right beside my truck. Its smile was so damn wide that the top half of its head caved towards its backside. Its razor-sharp teeth embellished a gaping black hole that was its mouth. I hit the gas pedal in hopes of escaping my tormentor once again. Except this time, it kept up to speed. Its long spindly limbs appeared as if they were in overdrive, scissoring up and down with intense extortion. Its head tilted up to the sky as if laughing at my pathetic efforts to escape. Up, down, up, down. Up and down went its honed legs as it maintained speed with the acceleration of my truck. My breathing intensified and my heart thudded with what was only raw fear. I quickly shifted my eyes to the right side of the road. Mile marker 66 reappeared once more. I released a guttural wail. As if in mockery, the entity began to cheerily zigzag its bicycle in delight at my panic. Its frenzied pedaling persisted as I tried to escape. What the fuck do you want from me? Leave me the hell alone. I screamed at the top of my lungs whilst hot tears streamed down my quivering face. The creature shook its white head to the sky, letting out a silent laugh of pleasure. Suddenly, it slowed its speed to a lazy stride, as if taking a casual ride out of leisure. I accelerated once more and the figure faded from view. I cried. I cried like a babe cries for its mother. Why was this happening to me? Why was I the victim of such torment? What was that thing? Now, I'm not much of a believer in the paranormal, but I'm reconsidering my worldview once I reach Amarillo. I slowed as another mile marker made its way into view. Mile 66. My heart dropped as I continued in the only direction I could go. Onward. This continued for several minutes as I sped forward. As my truck crept over a low hill, my despise awaited on the other side. The creature was casually bicycling forward, now in front of me. How it had managed to bypass my truck without my notice was beyond me. I had thrown out all logic and reason many miles ago. The creature slowly spun its head to look at me. Its body was still facing forward. Its mouth stretched into that insane smile. Suddenly, it bellowed the screech of a banshee. My blood ran as cold as ice. However, I quickly devised a plan. If my fate was to suffer in this purgatory, I did not want my tormentor to exist in this hell alongside me. I pounded the gas pedal with all of my strength and raced forward. This only made the creature smile wider. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst in a bloody heap from my chest. Closer. Closer. Ahead was another marker, mile 49. Closer. Oh my God, please work. My truck collided with my assailant. Its thin, wiry body entangled upon itself as it hit by the windshield. A collision of thuds could be heard atop my cab. I screeched to a halt. I put my truck in park and exited. The creature's bicycle lay in front of my truck. Its wheels were bent over themselves, like a dying roach curling in death's wake. I slowly paced towards the back of my truck and peered behind the cargo bed. The creature lay mutilated in the road. It was a broken mess of limbs, cracked in all unnatural directions. I peeked at its face. Even in death, its wide, razor-sharp smile pointed to the sky, having a final laugh. I started to hear cracking. The bastard wasn't dead. Its limbs began to fumble for stability. It snapped its neck and its horrifying grin met my eyes. I wasted no time. I sprinted back to my truck and floored the gas. In my mirror, the creature began to crawl upside down on all its broken limbs. It scrambled like a black widow ready to capture its prey. It gave one last piercing screech from its terrible mouth as I left that creature in the dust. I drove for what felt like hours. The road lay vacant as the black plains began to be sprinkled with scattered house lights. I passed the sign once more. Amarillo, 25 miles. I was free. I made it to Amarillo not long after. I delivered my shipment, phoned my boss immediately, and gave my resignation. I have no idea what happened on that forsaken night. I don't know what that creature was. What I do know is that I am scarred beyond repair. I sincerely hope the call center will take me back. I am a truck driver, and something has followed me 200 miles across the mountains. I have not been posting lately as I was off on a haul for a while. Whilst on that, something happened to me. Something awful. I can hardly close my eyes anymore without worrying something from my past will come back to get me. What happened to me on my most recent haul has darkened my past even more. Whilst my mind tries to repress these things, it also tries to convince me that they are not over and that whoever has troubled me is coming back. I was taking my cargo through the mountains with no service on my phone and no reception on the radio. Just the sound of nothing. It has been like this for miles, just me, my truck, and the road ahead. It was very refreshing, exactly what I needed after the trauma of my past years. I noticed the time and sped up. I wanted to be out of the mountains before dark, but at this rate, it wasn't looking likely. Some time went on and I was busting for a piss. I pulled up and got out. I was finishing up when I noticed something in the not-so-far distance. This was the first time I saw it. A creature resembling a man, a large man. I was about to call out when I realized that something was wrong with his face. I slowly realized that this wasn't a man at all. The shocking thing was, it wasn't any animal I'd seen before either. It stared straight at me. The 2-hour silence was finally broken by the loud cracking of twigs as this thing charged straight at me. I sprinted back to the van and got in. I immediately shoved the keys into the ignition. My peaceful trance had been snapped. I slammed down the accelerator, something I had to do way too much these days. As I began to roll off, I saw the thing burst from the tree line and onto the road behind me. I was picking up speed, but so was the creature. I finally made it to 20 kilometers per hour. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the thing standing in the road, staring after me with a snarl on its face. If it was a face at all. This thing must have been a seriously deformed man. It had a human body, but the stance of a wolf on its hind legs, its face much too big for a person. The eyes were not aligned and the mouth had retreated too far up its face. I shook my head and drove on. Another thing for my mind to repress and another thing to make my therapist tell me I'm crazy. I had covered a lot of ground and had almost made it out of the mountain range. Dusk had fallen hard onto the horizon and I had almost forgotten about what I had seen. My radio began to crackle, meaning I was picking a reception and it looked like my phone had a bar of signal. I was relieved and for the first time in ages, I smiled. The smile was ripped from my face as I looked out of my window. Upon a high-up rock to the side of me was the clear silhouette of the man. Its head turned and fixed on my truck. My heart sank into my gut and continued its descent as I saw the thing jump off the rock and charge down the hillside towards me. How the hell had it made it this far? There was no possible way for the man to have gotten there on foot. My confusion ceased when I noticed how close it was to me. I sped up, building speed way too slowly. The man was close now, almost able to grab onto the side of the rig. I noticed a corner up ahead. In the wing mirror, I saw him about to jump onto the back. I turned the corner very sharply. The thing had missed its opportunity and bounded off into the hills. I drove on for many miles. The darkness had settled now. I realized that my radio had stopped crackling and my phone still had no signal. I was sure I was meant to be out of the mountains by now. I stopped, looked at my map, and immediately knew I had taken the wrong turn. I had followed the signposts and had taken the sign that had pointed to Main Road. I thought back and recalled that the sign had been pretty wonky and had been tipped upside down. I realized how much of a fool I had been. It was the wrong road as the sign at right way up would have pointed the other way. In all my fear, I hadn't batted an eyelid. Looking at my map, there was nowhere to turn around for miles. With a heavy sigh, I drove on. As I set off, I could have sworn I saw something in the trees. Along the road, I kept noticing something walking behind the tree line, but I only saw it every couple of miles. I didn't even want to think about what it was. After what seemed like the longest drive of my life, I had reached the turning point and began to swing the truck around. Once I was facing the right direction, I let out a whimper. It was standing in the road in front of me. I got a better look at him this time. It was a man. He was tall and very wide. His face, like I had noticed earlier, was extremely disformed. He began to walk at me very fast. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't wait there and I couldn't reverse. I locked my door and drove forward, hoping to scare him off. For a brief moment, I thought I did. He began to walk around the side. I then heard him climbing up the passenger side. I grabbed the keys from my pocket and locked the doors. In the same second, I heard the heart-wrenching tug on the handle. A split second later, and that thing would have been inside. I swore, and I drove. The man was pounding on the window now, extremely hard. Thud, thud, thud. This was the single most horrifying moment of my life. I don't know what I was thinking, but I wound down the window a small amount. The man instantly stuck his fingers through. I then wound the window up quickly. He screamed and pulled them out, falling onto the roadside. I carried on driving, not looking back once. I made it onto the main road, turned the radio up to full, and almost cried when I saw other cars. My phone had a signal and I called my boss, telling him what had happened. He didn't believe me, of course, and told me to take the next few days off, and that he'd book me an appointment with the therapist in the morning. I felt so safe back on the busy road and was the happiest I had ever been to see traffic in my life. I lay in my bed that night, running things over in my head. As I looked out of my window, I was almost sure I could see something watching me. Surprisingly, I went straight to sleep and didn't wake up for 16 hours. I would never be driving a mountain route again. I am a truck driver, and there is a reason I don't stay in motels anymore. I have been a truck driver for some time now, and I have experienced many things on the road. Some have stayed with me for years, whilst some will probably stay with me forever. One of these experiences will for sure stay with me until the day I die. I had been placed on a very long journey, taking a load of 10 hours cross-country. There was nothing but dreadful music on the radio, and I was beginning to get tired. It had got dark some time ago and was now extremely late. I decided to call in for the night at the next motel I came across. I didn't even care if it was a bad one. I now really wish I had. I pulled up and looked around. The place looked awful. The paint was peeling off the walls. The windows were dirty and multiple letters were missing from the sign. The strangest part was that there were no cars in the parking lot. On any other occasion, I'd have taken that as a strong warning to stay away, but I'd been driving all day and did not have the energy to get back in the truck and drive somewhere else. I went over to the reception and there was no one there. I rang the bell and still no one came. I waited a few more minutes, repeatedly ringing the bell. Annoyed, I turned around and began to walk away, but then I heard a voice. I looked round to see an elderly man with very few teeth grinning at wildly. He welcomed me to the motel and asked me if he could be of assistance. I told him that I needed a room for the night and that I'd like a room with a view of my truck. I always ask this at quiet motels. It just makes me feel more secure for some reason. He fumbled around for a bit and then threw me a key with a room number on it. I paid him up front because I'd be setting off early in the morning. As I was walking up the stairs, I heard him say in a muffled tone, "You have a great night's sleep." He then chuckled to himself quietly. This should have creeped me out. I was far too exhausted to care. The first thing I noticed when I entered my room was that it was not facing my truck like I'd asked. Instead, just the dumpsters on the other side of the building. The bed was comfy and the room was big, but I couldn't help but feel that something wasn't right. There were stains on the carpet, dark stains. The walls were covered in marks, and there was something in a plastic bin bag in the bath. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was big. I lifted the top to see in, and I was almost sick. Inside was the head of a pig, not nicely severed like a butcher would do, but a deep, rough cut. This was disgusting, but as the walls were crawling with cockroaches anyway, I decided it best not to use the shower or the bath and drew the curtain across. I tried to forget about what I had seen. I awoke not to the sound of my alarm clock, but to the sound of voices outside my room. It was 2 a.m. Who would be out of bed at that time? I just assumed it was another guest and tried to get back to sleep, but before I could, I heard the unmistakable sound of a key in the lock. I flew out of bed and into the bathroom and immediately hid in the tub, trying to ignore the pig's head that lay next to me. The curtain was drawn across, but I could see a small amount through a moth-eaten hole in the curtain. I heard the door swing open and the sound of footsteps as someone entered the room. I peeked through the hole to see a man in a ski mask walk over to my bed. He had something in his hand. The man threw off the covers and cursed. I then heard the voice of the man from the reception whisper, "What's wrong?" The man in the ski mask responded, "He's not here. He must have left earlier than we thought he would." I then saw the man start leaving and a huge amount of relief washed over me. Then he stopped, turned around, and walked straight into the bathroom. It felt like my heart had stopped beating. I tried to flatten myself into the bottom of the tub, although I knew it wouldn't do much good. He stood there for a good few minutes. I then heard the man cough, spit something into the sink, and leave. When I was sure that they were gone, I got out, grabbed my bag, and left. I used the emergency exit at the side of the building, ran around till my truck got in, started the engine, and drove. As I was leaving, I saw someone in the window, staring at me. Grinning his nasty, toothless grin. I didn't look back and got out of there. I'd driven nearly 20 miles when I was pulled over by a highway patrolman. He asked me if I was aware my back doors were hanging open. I told him no and went to check it out. A large amount of my load had been stolen and many other boxes had been slashed open. I told the patrolman everything about the motel and what had happened to me. He shook his head in disbelief and told me something that made me gasp. That motel 20 miles up the road? The owner died there 4 years ago and it's been abandoned ever since.